The matron handed her a key. A single iron key, rust-spotted and heavy, the kind that opens something that hasn't been opened in a very long time. With it came a deed. A piece of land up in the Aldenmore Range, and $20 in bills so worn they felt like old skin. That was it. 18 years of existing in a place that never wanted her, and this was the sum of it. A key, a deed, $20. The matron said the land was worthless. Said the county had tried to take it for back taxes a dozen times and gave up because it wasn't worth the paperwork. She almost laughed. Almost. She didn't know then what that key opened. She didn't know about the ruin buried under 20 years of mountain weather. She didn't know about the iron chest, the journal, the woman who had written in it, a woman who understood heat and stone, and the slow, patient memory of the earth in ways that nobody in Greystone Hollow had ever bothered to learn. She didn't know that the most dangerous thing a person can be handed is something everyone else has already decided is worthless. Because worthless things don't get protected, and what isn't protected can be found. Her name was Era Mosswood. She was 18 years old. She had $20, a rusty key, and absolutely nothing left to lose. This is what she built. The day she turned 18, the world contracted to the size of a manila envelope. That was what Constance Weld placed on the desk in front of her. Thin, yellowed at the edges. The kind of envelope that had been waiting in a filing cabinet for years, patient and indifferent, the way bureaucracies are always patient and indifferent. Era Mosswood sat across from the matron of Ashford Home and watched the woman's hands smooth the envelope flat. Once, twice. A gesture so practiced it had lost all meaning. The office smelled of boiled starch and floor wax. A clock on the wall ticked. Outside the single narrow window, September light lay flat and gray against the pavement. Constance Weld did not look up right away. She was a woman who used silence the way other people used words, strategically, to make you feel the weight of your own smallness before she had to say anything at all. Era had learned over 18 years not to fill that silence. She waited. Finally, the matron folded her hands on top of the envelope and looked at her with the expression of someone completing an administrative task they found mildly unpleasant. Not cruel, just final. She said, "You are no longer a ward of the county. Your cot is needed. You are, as of today, an adult in the full legal sense of the word." Then she pushed the envelope across the desk. Inside was a deed. A property certificate, the parchment brittle and spotted with age, describing a parcel of land in the Aldenmore Range. A single iron key, rust-spotted and heavy, clinking against the bottom of the envelope when Era tipped it into her palm. And $20 in bills so soft and worn they felt like old cloth. That was it. 18 years. And this was the arithmetic of it. The matron explained without warmth, but also without particular malice, that the land had belonged to a woman named Marin Mosswood, a great-grandmother Era had never heard of, never been told about. The county had attempted to seize the property for unpaid taxes on multiple occasions, and on each occasion had quietly abandoned the effort because the land was so remote, so barren, so thoroughly without value that the paperwork cost more than the property was worth. Nobody wanted it, which meant it defaulted to the next of kin, which meant it defaulted to Era. The matron said this without any particular irony, as though she were reading from a form, as though she had not just described in administrative language the precise shape of a joke at someone's expense. Era looked at the key in her palm. Heavy, cold, rust like dried blood along the teeth. She looked up. Constance Weld was already pulling another file from her drawer. Moving on, because Era was already filed, already processed, already done. The door clicked shut behind her with a sound so quiet it was almost polite. She stood on the front steps of Ashford home with an envelope in one hand and a key in the other, and the September wind moved through her thin coat like it wasn't there at all. $20. A key that opened something she had never seen. A deed to land that nobody wanted. She almost laughed. Almost. She took the bus as far as it went. That was a town called Greystone Hollow, which clung to the base of the Aldenmore Range the way a barnacle clings to the underside of something much larger and much older than itself. The bus wheezed to a stop at a crossroads with a gas station and a hardware sign, and the driver looked at her in the rearview mirror with the specific expression of someone who expects you to reconsider. She got off. The town was the kind of small that has a long memory and very little patience for newcomers. The main street ran 4 blocks. There was a general store, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, a post office the size of a large closet, and a clapboard town hall that needed paint. The mountains behind it all were enormous, dark with pine, the peaks already wearing early snow like a warning. She bought a map at the gas station, studied it under the fluorescent light with the $20 still folded in her coat pocket, doing the math in her head without wanting to. The land was deep in, past the end of any maintained road, past where the roads turned to tracks and the tracks turned to suggestion. She would walk. It took 2 days. The first day, the road was real, if barely. Rutted gravel that climbed steadily upward through stands of birch and maple, the leaves going copper and amber in the September cold. She passed 2 farms, both shuttered for the season. Past a rusted gate with a hand-painted "No Trespassing" sign so old the letters were barely legible. Then the road became a track. Then the track became a line through tall grass, where someone had once walked regularly enough to flatten a path. Then it became nothing. Just the map, just the compass direction, just the particular way the light fell through the trees at mid-morning when she was heading east, northeast. The second day was harder. Her feet found the places where the ground was soft and gave way, where old roots made the terrain unpredictable, where creek crossings meant soaked boots that didn't dry. The temperature dropped. Her thin coat, which had been inadequate in town, became almost satirical up here. The wind had an edge to it that felt personal. She ate the last of the bread she'd bought at the gas station and kept moving. And then, late in the afternoon of the second day, she found it. A stone marker. Ancient, carved with a property line notation so weathered she had to crouch and trace the letters with her finger to read them. The ground beyond it sloped down into a kind of hollow between 2 rising ridges sheltered from the prevailing wind east-facing for morning light. Whoever had chosen this location had chosen it with care. She followed the slope down and saw what was left. It was not a ruin, not in the romantic sense of the word, not the kind of ruin that suggests former grandeur, or at least the dignity of a structure that once meant something. It was a collapse, a foundation of stacked fieldstone, maybe 30 feet across, filled with decades of fallen timber and encroaching earth. The walls had caved inward. A massive oak beam lay broken across the center of it, half buried under soil, and the skeletal remains of what might once have been a roof. Beside the foundation, a depression in the earth indicated where a cellar had been. It had subsided. The ground over it was soft and uneven like a bruise. The whole thing looked like the mountain had tried to swallow it and then changed its mind. Era stood at the edge of it. She stood there for a long time. Wind moved through the empty space where walls had been. It made a sound, not quite a moan, more like the way a voice sounds when it's very far away, and you're not sure you heard it at all. This was her inheritance. She sat down on a large flat stone at what might once have been the threshold of the front door. Put the envelope in her lap. Put the key on top of it. And looked at the pile of rocks and the gray sky and the dark tree line on the ridge above. The cold was immediate and specific. Not the cold of being outdoors in autumn. The cold of a place that had been empty for a very long time. Nobody wanted it. She understood now with a clarity that the matron's administrative language had not conveyed exactly what had been done to her. This wasn't an inheritance. This was a disposal, a way of meeting the legal obligation to provide something while providing in practical terms nothing. They had handed her the key to an absence and sent her into the mountains. The $20 was an insult. The deed was a ghost. The key was heavier than ever in her palm and opened nothing she could see. She sat there until the light changed. Then she sat there some more. The night was the worst she had ever spent, and she had spent some bad nights in Ashford Home's drafty upper dormitory. She wedged herself into a shallow depression between two large foundation stones, pulled her coat tight, and waited for morning in the way you wait, when morning feels very far away, and warmth feels like something that belongs to another life. She did not sleep so much as move through a series of states that were not quite consciousness. Cold was the only constant. In the darkest part of the night, she thought clearly and without particular emotion that staying here was a form of dying slowly. That going back to Greystone Hollow was a form of begging. That there were only two directions and neither of them was forward. The thought wasn't frightening. That was the frightening part. It wasn't frightening at all. Morning came gray and reluctant. Frost. The first real frost of the season, coating every surface in a thin, bright skin of ice crystals. Every dead leaf outlined in white. Every blade of grass stiff and sparkling. The kind of beauty that costs something. The kind that doesn't care whether you appreciate it. She sat up. Her body protested loudly. Her back. Her hip. The cold had worked its way into the joint of her shoulder and was planning to stay. She looked at the ruin. Then she looked down at the foundation stone she'd been leaning against, and she saw it. A flower. Single stem. Purple. Small enough to be overlooked, growing from a crack in the stone no wider than her finger. The frost had touched it, but not killed it. The petals were still open, still reaching toward whatever weak light the morning offered. It had absolutely no business being there. The soil in that crack was barely soil, mostly grit and old mortar dust. The crack faced north. The frost had come. The season was wrong in every way, and it was blooming. She stared at it for a very long time. Then something inside her moved. Not inspiration, nothing so clean as that. Something older and less articulate. The thing that moves in an animal that has been cornered and has just decided it is finished being cornered. She stood up. Every muscle in her body registered its objection. She stood up anyway, and she looked at the ruin not as a grave, but as a problem that had a before, which meant it might have an after. She started clearing. She started with the cellar depression because the cellar was below grade, and below grade meant sheltered from the wind. That was the only logic. She didn't have a plan. She had a direction and a pair of hands and the specific focused energy of someone who has decided that doing something badly is better than doing nothing correctly. She moved rock. She pulled at fallen timber. She dug with her hands where the soil had compacted over the collapsed entrance, her fingers finding the edge of a wooden frame, rotted but still present, still indicating where a door had been. The work was hard and cold and completely absorbing, which was the point. She worked until the light began to go. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd uncovered. A slope of debris, the suggestion of a space below. The massive broken oak beam that had partially collapsed inward but had not quite surrendered. She slept better that night. Not warm, but better. In the morning, she kept going. It was on the third afternoon, working with a piece of fallen timber, as a lever prying at a large wedged slab of slate that had fallen across the cellar entrance, that she felt the space below shift. Give. The slab moved with a sound like a long exhale, and cold air breathed up from below. Different cold, still cold, but still earth cold. The kind of cold that doesn't move, that has been sitting quietly in the dark for decades, patient in a way that has nothing to do with the cutting, restless cold of the mountain wind. She wedged the slab further, shone the small flashlight she'd bought with part of her $20 down into the opening. The cellar had not fully collapsed. The broken oak beam had cracked and sagged, but held, creating a triangular space beneath it, cramped but present. The floor was buried under fallen earth and debris, but the walls, thick fieldstone laid by someone who knew what they were doing, had largely held. She dropped down through the opening. Dust. Dark. The small circle of her flashlight, moving across stone walls, across the ruins of wooden shelving, across a floor half buried in earth. And then the light found it. In the far corner, wedged beneath the remains of collapsed shelving, partially buried, but protected by the angle of the fallen timber above it. An iron chest, strapped and riveted, old, heavy. The lock was rusted solid. She spent an hour on the lock, used a pointed rock as a chisel, a piece of timber as a mallet, the cold working against her fingers until she couldn't feel them properly. The hasp was weaker than the lock. That was what finally gave. One rivet, then another. The metal bent, shrieked, snapped. She lifted the lid with both hands. No gold, no money. Of course not. On top, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry through what must have been decades of the cellar's slow decay, a journal. Leather-bound, thick. The pages cream-colored and dense with handwriting, a script so precise and controlled, it looked almost architectural. Beneath the journal tools, she didn't recognize heavy and purposeful-looking wrapped in more oilcloth. Several sealed tins, a folded paper that turned out to be a survey map of the property annotated in the same precise hand. She lifted the journal, opened it. The first page read, in a confident, unhurried hand, the collected principles of thermal inertia and masonry convection. Marin Mosswood Proprietor, Aldenmore Ridge, Northern Property, 3rd Survey. She sat in the dirt of a collapsed cellar at the end of the world with a dead woman's journal in her lap and read until the light from her flashlight went yellow and weak, and the cold had worked its way back into her bones. Marin Mosswood was not who anyone had told Era she was. Not that anyone had told Era anything. But the absence of information is its own kind of information, and what Era had absorbed in the way you absorb the things that aren't said was that Marin had been odd, isolated, a woman who lived alone in the mountains and died there, which people tend to read as a cautionary tale about eccentricity. The journal told a different story. Marin had come to the Aldenmore Range not to hide. She'd come to test something. The journal was a working document, part research record, and part obsessive manifesto charting a decade of experiment and refinement in the practical science of heat. She had studied masonry heaters, the ancient European designs that used stone mass to capture and slowly release warmth. She had surveyed the land for its clay deposits, its soapstone veins, its thermal properties at various depths. She had calculated with the precision of someone who had taught herself mathematics from books and physics from observation exactly how much mass was required to store enough heat for an 18-hour cycle from a single firing. She had built it. She had built it and tested it and refined it through 3 winters before she wrote the entry that stopped Era cold. It works. Completely. Efficiency far exceeds conventional heating at 1/5 the fuel cost. This winter inside temperature held at 68 degrees for 22 hours from a single morning fire during a period when outside temperatures dropped to -4. The earth below the frost line holds at 45 degrees regardless of surface conditions. The cellar alone, without any additional heat source, maintained 38 degrees throughout the worst week. And then a few pages later, in smaller writing, that looked like it had been added quickly, almost urgently, EV came again. 3rd time this month. Same offer, same tone. I told him again. This land is not for sale. It will never be for sale. He left differently this time. I don't know what differently means yet. I'm going to make copies of the most important pages and seal them separately. Just in case. EV. Ira turned the pages slowly, looking. There were gaps. Places where pages had been removed, not torn carelessly, but cut close to the spine, done deliberately. What remained was enough to show the shape of what was missing. Technical notes that referenced earlier observations no longer present. A series of dates with no corresponding entries. And the entries that remained grew shorter, more clipped. The confident architectural script becoming smaller, tighter, as though the writer was trying to take up less space. The last dated entry was 23 years ago. It ended mid-sentence. Era closed the journal. She sat in the dark cellar for a long time. Then she climbed out, walked the perimeter of the ruined foundation in the last thin light of afternoon, and made a decision. She would go to Greystone Hollow. She would get what she needed, and she would come back. The walk down took a day and a half. She moved faster going downhill, and something in her had recalibrated. The landscape felt different, not friendlier. The Aldenmore Range was not in the business of being friendly, but different, less like an obstacle and more like a fact, something to understand rather than fight. She reached Greystone Hollow mid-morning on a Thursday. The general store was a wide-fronted clapboard building on the main intersection, the kind of store that smells of coffee and sawdust and the specific mineral smell of hardware. A hand-painted sign above the door said, Pratt's Provisions, established 1961. A bell rang when she opened the door. Behind the counter, a man looked up. He was somewhere in his early 60s, built like someone who had spent a long time doing physical work and had not stopped. Face creased by weather. Eyes a pale, particular blue that had the quality of looking at things from a slight distance, assessing before deciding what to do with what they saw. She put her list on the counter. He read it without touching it. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at her hands, the scraped knuckles, the broken nails, the specific kind of damage that comes from moving rock with inadequate tools. He said, "You're the Mosswood girl." She said, "Era." He said, "Gideon Pratt." He didn't offer his hand, just looked at the list again. Fire brick, refractory mortar, hydraulic cement, stovepipe 6-inch, a good long-handled shovel, sand by the bag. He said, "That's an interesting list." She said, "It's what I need." He said, "For what?" She said, "I'm building." He looked at her for a moment with those pale, assessing eyes. And then the bell over the door rang again, and someone else came in, and that someone altered the temperature of the room in the specific way that certain kinds of authority always do. Councilman Harlan Voss was a man who had spent his life being listened to and had organized himself around the assumption that this would continue. He was well dressed for a Thursday morning in a town this size. Clean wool coat, good boots. The particular posture of a man who checks his own reflection often and is generally satisfied with what he sees. He was probably 55, maybe a few years older. He had his father's name, and Era would later understand a great deal more besides. He looked at her with the instant comprehensive dismissal that some people deploy without even knowing they're doing it. The assessment so quick it's almost unconscious. The conclusion so foregone it barely registers as a conclusion at all. He said to Gideon rather than to Era, though she was standing right there, "That the Mosswood girl, I take it." "I heard the county finally managed to get rid of the old ruin up on the ridge. I figured we'd see her back in town inside a week, begging or passing through." He looked at the list on the counter. Then he laughed. Not unkindly, which was almost worse. "Fire brick." He said it the way you'd repeat a punchline. "Child, I've lived in this valley for 55 years. I know what winter looks like up on that ridge. You can't build anything that'll hold against it. Not without capital. Not without the right materials, proper framing insulation, double-paned windows, a real heating system, probably several thousand gallons of propane, and the infrastructure to use it. What you've got there is a camping supply list with ambitions above its station." He said this pleasantly. That was the thing. He said it the way people say things when they've decided they're being generous by explaining the obvious. He picked up a tin of tobacco from the shelf behind Gideon. Set his money on the counter. Looked at Gideon directly the way you look at someone you consider an equal when you're making a point to someone you don't. He said, "Don't extend credit for a fool's errand. You'll regret it." The bell rang. He was gone. Silence moved back in. Gideon stood behind the counter. He was looking at the place where Voss had been standing. His expression gave nothing away. Then he looked at Era. He said, "You've got the money for this?" She said, "I have $20, about 11 of it left." He looked at the list. He looked at her. He said, "You know what this list is for. Not a cabin, not a quick shelter. This is for a masonry stove and a subterranean structure. Do you know what those are?" She reached into her coat, put the journal on the counter. He looked at it. His face changed just slightly. Something in the pale eyes shifted. He didn't reach for it. He said, "Is that Marin's?" She said, "You knew her?" He said, "I was about 12 when she was still coming down to town for supplies. She used to buy fire brick by the pallet. Everyone thought she was eccentric. She paid every bill on time. Never once short." He was quiet for a moment. He said she never told anyone what she was building up there. Era said she wrote it all down. Everything. He looked at the journal for a long moment. Then he looked at the list. Then he seemed to make a decision that involved some internal accounting she wasn't entirely privy to. He said, "You come back in the spring. We'll settle up then." She said, "Why would you do that?" He said, "Because I knew her. Because she paid her debts. And because Voss has been wrong about things before." He started gathering items from the shelves, moving with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. And then, without comment, he added things that weren't on her list. A heavy wool blanket, a pair of thick leather work gloves, a sack of flour, dried beans, a small tin of coffee. He set it all on the counter. A woman appeared in the doorway that led to the back. She was around 58, give or take. Dark hair going silver. The kind of face that had been beautiful and had become something better than beautiful, with age more specific, more particular to itself. She was wiping her hands on a kitchen cloth and looking at Era with an expression Era couldn't immediately place. Not pity, not curiosity, something quieter than both. Gideon said, "Wynne, this is Era Mosswood. She's heading back up to the ridge." Wynne Pratt looked at her for a moment. Then she disappeared back through the doorway. Returned 30 seconds later with a tin box, the kind that once held shortbread now repurposed. She set it on top of the pile of supplies. "Cornbread," she said. "It travels well." That was all she said. Era looked at the tin, at the blanket, at the flour and the beans and the gloves. She had been prepared for refusal. She had half prepared for charity, delivered with the specific weight of obligation, the kind that costs the giver nothing and costs the receiver something every time they think about it. This was neither. This was just given, without performance. She couldn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be back in the spring." Gideon loaded the supplies into an old steel frame pack from the back room and helped her adjust it. At the door, he stopped. He said one thing. She waited. He said Harlan Voss's father was Edmund Voss. He was on the county council when Marin was up on that ridge. They had some kind of disagreement about the land. I was a kid. I don't know the details, but I remember the way people stopped talking about her after. The way a name just disappears from conversation. He looked at her steadily. He said, "Be careful what you find up there." She looked back at him. She said, "I already found some of it." He nodded once, said nothing more. The bell rang as she pushed through the door. She turned north. The Aldenmore Range rose above the tree line ahead of her, enormous and indifferent, the upper ridges already white. The pack on her back was heavy with everything she needed to begin. She had been handed a key to an absence. She was beginning to understand what the absence was hiding. She came back to the ruin with 80 pounds on her back and a dead woman's journal against her chest. The pack cut into her shoulders on the uphill sections. The new gloves helped. The old path, such as it was, felt different now that she knew what was at the end of it. Less like a road to nowhere. More like a road to something that hadn't been named yet. She reached the hollow in late afternoon. The ruin waited in the shadow of the east ridge, same as she'd left it. Collapsed. Patient. The stone marker at the property line catching the last horizontal light. She dropped the pack, stood there breathing. Then she pulled out the journal, turned to the page she'd marked, and read Marin's first instruction one more time. Begin with the earth. Everything else follows from the earth. So she began. The first week was excavation. Not elegant, not planned in any sophisticated way. Just the logic of the shovel and the wheelbarrow she'd assembled from the kit Gideon had included without comment, and the slow, heavy work of moving earth from where it was to where it needed not to be. The cellar had to be larger. Marin's diagrams specified dimensions with the precision of someone who had calculated the relationship between volume and thermal mass, down to the cubic foot. 12 feet by 14, 7 feet of ceiling clearance. Walls at minimum 20 inches of fieldstone with a rubble core. Floor paved in flat stone, set in clay mortar. Era had none of these things yet. She had a hole in this ground, and a shovel, and the specific mindless rhythm of digging that quieted everything else. Which was what she needed, because when she stopped moving, she thought. And when she thought, she found herself circling back to what Gideon had said at the door. Edmund Voss. The way a name disappears from conversation. The cut pages in the journal precise along the spine, done by someone who knew what they were removing. Evie came again. She dug. She hauled. She dug some more. The work had its own education. She learned that fieldstone lays better when you sort it first. Largest pieces for the base courses, flat faces outward, the irregular backs packed tight with smaller rubble and clay. She learned that mortar mixed too wet slides before it sets, and mortar mixed too dry crumbles when you try to work it. She learned these things by doing them wrong and then doing them again. Marin had written about this, not in the technical sections, in the margins. Small notations that weren't part of the formal instruction, but existed alongside it, the way a person's real voice exists alongside their official one. First attempts will teach you more than any diagram. The diagram tells you where to go. The failures tell you how. Ira read those margin notes in the evenings, sitting close to the small fire she built in the open air above the cellar, because the cellar was still too raw and damp for enclosed flame. She read by firelight until the fire burned low, and the cold came back in earnest, and then she climbed into the cellar and slept in the relative stillness below the frost line. 38 degrees, even without any heat source, just as Marin had calculated, cold enough to need the blanket and the wool hat she'd started wearing to sleep. But not the bone-deep cold of exposure. Not the killing kind. The earth remembers the summer Marin had written. It holds the memory of warmth deep in its bones long after the surface has forgotten. She was beginning to understand that this was not a metaphor. October arrived without announcing itself. The light changed first. It went from the full, generous light of September, which forgives a great deal, to something thinner and more specific light that made edges sharper and shadows longer, and didn't stay for nearly as long as you wanted it to. Then the temperature followed. Nights dropped into the low 20s. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, which she'd been using for water, developed a rim of ice each morning that took until midday to melt. The high ridge above her wore permanent snow now. Not the early season dusting of September. Real snow. Heavy and settled and there to stay. She worked faster. The cellar walls were up to shoulder height. The floor was paved. The entrance staircase, which Marin had specified as angled rather than straight. A deliberate design to trap cold air at the bottom rather than let it roll straight into the living space, was taking shape in fitted stone that she had to cut and chip to fit a slow, precise process that made her hands ache and her eyes tired, and produced, when a piece finally seated correctly, a satisfaction disproportionate to the action. She had begun to understand what Marin meant about the staircase. Cold air was heavy. It sank. An angled stair with a deep well at the bottom gave the cold air a place to go that was not into the main space. Simple physics, elegant application. The kind of solution that looks obvious once you understand it and is invisible until you do. The journal was full of these. Solutions that looked like common sense until you realized that common sense applied with this level of rigor and observation became something else entirely. Became knowledge. Became the kind of understanding that could be written down and sealed in an iron chest and still be useful to a stranger 23 years later. Era read Marin's notes on the clay deposit every night until she had the location memorized. 200 yards north-northeast of the foundation along the creek bank, where the water had cut through the hillside and exposed the substrate. Gray-blue clay, plastic and smooth between the fingers when wet. The right kind. She found it exactly where Marin said it would be. That was the moment she started talking to her. Not out loud, not exactly. But there was a quality to the reading that shifted from study to conversation, from absorbing instruction to responding to it. She would read a passage and think you were right about that, or I tried it the other way first, same as you said I would. She would find a margin note that anticipated an exact mistake she'd made 3 days earlier and feel something complicated. Recognition, gratitude. A species of grief for a person she had never met and was only now beginning to know. You were right about the mortar, she thought one evening, sitting on the cellar floor with the journal open and a cup of weak coffee going cold in her hand. You were right about all of it. The journal didn't answer, but it felt sometimes like it almost did. The soapstone was the next challenge. Marin had mapped a vein of it in an outcropping on the south-facing slope 1/2 mile from the foundation. soapstone for the firebox lining of the masonry heater, because soapstone could absorb and release heat without cracking, without the expansion stress that destroyed ordinary stone. Marin had tested 3 different stone types before arriving at soapstone. She had written about the failures with the detached interest of a scientist, and occasionally with the undisguised frustration of a person who has just watched 3 months of work crack along the firebox seam on the coldest night of February. Lessons she'd written. Stone that looks right is not always stone that behaves right. Take longer. Test more. The cold has infinite patience. Your materials must have more. Era found the outcropping, cut soapstone with a cold chisel, and a hammer working the natural seams, learning which direction the rock wanted to split, and going with it rather than against. She loaded the cut pieces onto a small sled she'd improvised from salvaged timber and dragged them back to the site. It was slow. The October light was short. Her arms, by the end of each hauling day, felt like things that belonged to someone else detached from her body by a general hum of exhaustion that had become her baseline state. She didn't stop. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant the pages with the cut edges and the initials EV, and the question of what a man does exactly when a woman alone on a mountain refuses to be bought. She knew what he'd done. She just didn't have all the words for it yet. It was the 14th day of October when she found the additional pages. Not in the main journal. In the false bottom of the iron chest, which she discovered by accident when she was moving the chest to a drier section of the cellar, and felt the base flex slightly under pressure, in a way solid iron shouldn't. She pried it up carefully with a screwdriver blade. A thin packet of folded papers, wrapped in oilcloth. The same precise handwriting, but smaller, faster. The hand of someone writing in a hurry, or in secret, or both. These were the pages that had been cut from the journal. Not all of them, not a complete record, but enough. EV first visit offered fair market value for the parcel. Declined. He was polite. EV second visit revised offer higher. Still declined. He was less polite. EV third visit did not make an offer. Told me I should consider my position carefully. Used the word isolated twice. Used the word unfortunate once in reference to what might happen to a woman in my situation if the wrong kind of attention were drawn to her. EV fourth visit arrived with a man from the county assessor's office. They claimed there was a question about the property survey. There is no question about the property survey. I have the original documentation. They left. And then later in a different ink written with less control, the letters slightly larger, as though the hand needed more room. The county has placed a disputed ownership notice on the property. This is not a legal instrument. It is a tactic. My solicitor in Dunmore has sent a response. But my solicitor in Dunmore costs money. I am running short of, and Edmund Voss knows this, and I believe that is precisely the point. I am making copies of the technical documents, sealing them separately. The work must survive, even if I cannot protect it here. The last line on the last page. I hope, whoever you are, that you are someone who does not give up easily. Era sat on the cellar floor with the papers in her hands and didn't move for a long time. She was looking at the arithmetic of it, the specific patient machinery of it, not violence, not anything that would leave marks anyone could point to. Just a disputed notice, a legal expense, an isolated woman with limited resources and no one nearby who would involve themselves. Just pressure applied steadily from a position of institutional comfort against a person who had no institutional comfort at all. Harlan Voss had been 12 years old when his father was doing this. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he knew everything. She didn't know which was worse. She folded the papers, put them back in the oilcloth, put them at the bottom of the chest, put the false bottom back. Then she picked up her trowel and went back to work. Because the work was the answer. Not to Edmund Voss, not to Harlan, not to the county's disputed notices and the cut pages and the silence that had swallowed a woman who deserved to be remembered. The answer was the stove, the masonry heater, which Marin had designed and built and proven, which had worked perfectly 3 winters running before she ran out of time and resources and was pushed out of the place she had made for herself. Era would finish it. That was the answer. She would finish it, and it would work, and the work itself would say everything that needed to be said in a language older and more durable than words. Stone by stone. The masonry heater rose from the center of the cellar floor, like something being excavated rather than built. Which in a way it was. Marin's design was not an invention so much as a rediscovery, a form so logical, so attuned to the actual physics of heat and mass and combustion that variations of it had appeared independently in a dozen cultures across several centuries. The Scandinavian kachalofen, the Russian pechka, the Korean ondol, different names, same understanding, the understanding that stone remembers. The foundation plinth first. A square base of the densest fieldstone she could find, set in clay mortar, 4 feet by 4 feet, 18 inches high. Level. Absolutely level. Marin had underlined this 3 times. The firebox next. Soapstone fitted and trimmed the pieces so precisely cut that she could feel the temperature of the stone through her work gloves, even in the October cold, that deep mineral coolness that would become eventually warmth. She built the firebox on a Tuesday and spent the next 2 days constructing the first baffle channel. The channel was the secret of the thing, the reason it worked. Hot gas from the fire, instead of rushing straight up a chimney and taking all its heat with it into the open air, was forced to travel. Up through the first channel, down through the second, across through the third. A long, winding, reluctant journey that stripped the gas of nearly every calorie of heat before it was finally allowed to leave. That captured heat went into the stone, and the stone being stone held it. She was 3 courses into the second baffle when she dropped the soapstone. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about moments that change everything. They rarely announce themselves. She was fitting a piece of soapstone into the channel wall, her right hand holding the piece in position, while her left reached for the trowel, and the piece shifted, and she overreached, and the weight transferred wrong, and 40 pounds of dense rock came straight down onto her right hand, where it rested on the edge of the plinth. The sound was brief. The pain was not. She pulled her hand back, looked at it. Already swelling the skin across the knuckles, going tight and shiny, 2 fingers at an angle that suggested a conversation with a doctor would have been appropriate if there had been a doctor within 5 miles. She sat down on the cellar floor, breathed, did not scream, though she wanted to. Screaming felt like something that would use up resources she needed for other things. She wrapped the hand with the clean cloth she'd been using as a mortar rag, tied it off one-handed against her knee. Then she looked at the half-built stove, the level of the work, the precision of the soapstone cuts, the way the baffle was taking shape. She could not do this one-handed. She could not stop. These 2 facts occupied the same space for a long moment. Then she went upstairs outside to the small fire she kept going above ground and made herself eat something. Beans, flatbread. The last of Win Pratt's cornbread, which she had been rationing for reasons that felt sentimental and were probably also practical. She slept badly. In the morning, the hand was worse. swollen to the second knuckle on the two damaged fingers, purple in a way that was visually impressive and physically alarming. She could bend them slightly, which she understood meant they were probably fractured rather than fully broken, a distinction that was medically significant and practically meaningless because the result was the same. She could not grip. She could not lay stone. She could not mix mortar. She could carry water. She could tend the fire. She could read. So she did those things and tried to treat it as time rather than loss, and failed at the reframing approximately every 20 minutes. On the third day, she heard footsteps on the approach path. She was above ground, sitting on the old threshold stone, with the journal in her lap, and her wrapped hand resting on her knee, and she heard the specific sound of boots on the frost-hardened ground, and looked up. Winifred Pratt was coming down the slope with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing whether it was the right one. She was wearing a heavy barn coat and work boots and a wool hat pulled low. Her silver dark hair was braided back. She moved over the uneven ground with the ease of someone who had spent time outdoors and trusted her footing. She reached the threshold stone, looked at Era, looked at the wrapped hand. She said, "That looks bad." Era said, "It's fine." Wynne said, "It is not fine. It's the wrong color to be fine." She set down the canvas bag, opened it. Inside a pot wrapped in dish towels that was still warm when Era touched it, a smell of chicken and thyme lifting from it even through the cloth. Actual medical bandaging, not cloth strips. A tin of salve that smelled of calendula and something sharper medicinal. She said, "Let me see it." Era held out the hand. Wynne unwrapped the cloth rag without comment on the rag, which was a mercy. She examined the hand with the matter-of-fact attention of someone who had dealt with injuries before. Not squeamish, not alarmed, just looking at what was there. She said 2 fingers, not fully broken, but close. She said, "You need to immobilize these." She splinted both fingers against a small flat stick she produced from the bag with the air of someone who had anticipated this specific requirement, which she probably had, and wrapped them with the proper bandaging. Firm, efficient, done in under 4 minutes. Then she looked up. She said, "How long have you been working one-handed?" Era said, 3 days. Wynne looked at the cellar entrance, at the descending staircase, at the pile of cut soapstone waiting beside it. She said, "Can I see?" They went down. Wynne stood in the cellar and looked at the work. The walls, the floor. The half-built stove rising from its foundation plinth in the center of the space. She walked around it slowly, not touching. Looking at the mortar joints, the precision of the soapstone fitting the way the baffle channel was beginning to describe itself in the stonework. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said Gideon's grandfather built something like this for the old farmstead out on Route 12, before the house burned. Era said, "Does Gideon remember it?" Wynne said Gideon was 4 when the house burned. He remembers being warm, that's all. She looked at the firebox. She said, "This is what the journal describes." Era said every measurement, every material. She tested it for 3 winters. Wynne was quiet again. She put her hand on the cellar wall. The field stone. The careful coursing. She said, "You did all of this." It wasn't a question. She was just acknowledging it. Era said she showed me how. Wynne looked at her then, really looked, the way people sometimes do when they're seeing you for the first time, even though they've been in the same room for 10 minutes. She sat down on a low section of the wall that Era used as a bench, folded her hands in her lap. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the silence outside. Inside the cellar, the world's noise was muffled. The wind didn't reach. The cold was present, but neutral, stable. Wynne said my son would have been 26 this year. She said it simply, without warning, the way people sometimes say the things they've been carrying the longest, suddenly because the weight of it has reached a threshold, and the next available moment gets it, whether the moment is ready or not. Ira didn't speak. Wynne said he died 8 years ago. Accident. He was on the highway in bad weather, and the other driver came across the center line. She looked at her hands. She said, after that, I stopped believing things could be built. I know how that sounds. I mean it literally. I couldn't watch Gideon fix things around the store without feeling like it was pointless. Because what's the point of making something solid when everything solid can just go? She looked up at the half-built stove. She said I told Gideon not to extend you the credit. Ira looked at her. Wynne said I told him you'd be gone by the first snow. Not to be cruel, I didn't believe it anymore. That someone could come here with nothing and build something that would hold. She was quiet. Then she said, I came up here because I owed you an apology, and because I wanted to see if I'd been wrong. She looked around the cellar. At the walls. At the stove. She said I was wrong. The word sat in the still air of the cellar. Ira said you came up a mountain to apologize to someone you've met once. Wynne said Gideon didn't know I was coming. I want that noted. Something moved in Ira's chest. A small loosening of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. She said there's soup. Wynne said I know. I brought it. They ate the soup sitting on opposite ends of the bench wall in the cellar, the steam rising from the cups in the cold air. It was the best thing Ira had eaten since she'd left Ashford home. She didn't say that, but she thought it very clearly. Wynne looked at the journal which was sitting on the small shelf Ira had built into the wall. She said, May I? Ira said yes. Wynne picked it up, opened it carefully, turned the pages with the specific delicacy of someone handling something they understand to be irreplaceable. She read slowly, stopped at the margin notes, read those twice. She said she was funny. Ira said, I know. Wynne said not in an obvious way, but first attempts will teach you more than any diagram. That's funny, and true, and a little bit mean in the best possible way. She kept reading. After a while, she said without looking up the section on the baffle channels. Your second channel. The measurement she gives for the channel width. You may want to reread that. Ira looked at her. Wynne turned the journal so she could see the diagram. Pointed to a notation in the margin that Ira had read but not fully parsed. She said the channel width at the second descent should be slightly narrower than the first. To increase velocity. She writes about it 3 pages back. You build a second channel the same width as the first, and you lose 15% of your heat capture efficiency. Ira stared at the diagram, then at the half-built second channel. She said I haven't gotten that far yet. Wynne said I know. I'm telling you before you do. She turned another page, kept reading. The afternoon light shifted. The cellar grew dimmer. Ira lit the small oil lamp she'd rigged on a stone shelf, and the space filled with soft amber light that made the stone walls look warmer than they were. Almost warm enough? Wynne said, still reading the outer skin of the stove. She says to use the most beautiful stone you can find. Ira said I know. Wynne said that seems unscientific. Ira said she had a theory about it, that the care you put into the surface reflects the care you put into everything else. That beauty and function aren't opposites, that the stove you take pride in is the stove you maintain properly. Wynne looked up. She said that's not unscientific at all. That's just honest. She closed the journal, held it for a moment before setting it back on the shelf. She said, I'll come back, when your hand is better. if you want help with the outer courses. Ira looked at her. She said, "You know how to lay stone." Wynne said, "Gideon's family built most of this valley. I've been watching for 30 years. At some point, watching turns into knowing whether you intend it to or not." She stood up, pulled her coat back into place. She said, "Keep the hand still for 4 days, at minimum. And sleep, not just lie down until it's light enough to work again." Ira said, "You sound like you've said that to someone before." Wynne said, "Gideon. Constantly. He has the same idea you do that rest is a failure of effort." She picked up the canvas bag. At the staircase, she stopped, looked back at the cellar, at the work, at the stove in its unfinished state rising from the center of the floor. She said, "It's going to work, isn't it?" It wasn't quite a question. Ira said she built it and it worked for 3 winters. Wynne said, "I know. I mean yours, the one you're building." Ira looked at the stove, at the soapstone firebox, at the precise baffle channels, the care of the mortar joints, the foundation plinth set level and true. She said yes. Wynne nodded once, went up the stairs. Ira listened to her footsteps cross the ground above and recede into the afternoon. Then she sat in the amber lamplight and held her splinted hand carefully in her lap and looked at the half-built stove and thought about a woman who had sat in this same space 23 years ago and understood something so important that someone had thought it worth the effort of taking it away from her. 4 days. She would rest for 4 days. Then she would finish it. The hand was usable at 5 days. Not good, but usable. She went back to the stone on the morning of the 16th of October with the specific careful attention of someone who has learned recently and conclusively that impatience has a physical cost. Wynne came back 4 days after that. She came with more food and without announcement the way she seemed to do things, and she looked at the progress on the outer courses of the stove and said nothing for a moment. Then she took off her coat, picked up the spare trowel, and started laying stone. They worked alongside each other without talking much, which turned out to be its own kind of conversation. The passing of stone, the assessment of a piece, the wordless agreement that it was the wrong shape, the search for a better one, the small corrections, the moments when one of them spotted what the other had missed and pointed without explaining, because pointing was enough. Wynne's hands knew stone. That was obvious within the first hour. 30 years of watching had, as she said, turned into something else. She laid courses with an efficiency and confidence that made Ira look like what she was, a quick learner, but not yet a practiced one. She said at one point, without stopping work, "Gideon told me what he knows about Edmund Voss and your great-grandmother." Ira said he didn't tell me much. Wynne said there's not much to tell. He was a boy. He heard adult conversations in the way children hear adult conversations. Partially, out of context. He knew Voss wanted the land and didn't get it, and that after a while, nobody mentioned the woman on the mountain anymore. She set a stone, checked its level. She said, "Harlan Voss is not his father." Ira said, "I know." Wynne said, "I don't say that as a defense. I say it because it complicates things. A person who inherits a wrong and doesn't know they've inherited it is in a different position than a person who knew and chose it." Ira said, "And a person who inherits a wrong and doesn't question it." Wynne was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes, that's the harder question." She laid another stone. She said, "What will you do with what you found?" Ira said, "I don't know yet." And she didn't. She knew she had the pages. She knew what they described. She knew that the name E.V. connected to Harlan Voss in a way that was direct enough to be significant and distant enough to be complicated. She also knew that the most important thing right now was the stove. The answer to every question she had come to believe was the stove. Not as a metaphor. Literally, the stove working was the proof. The proof was the answer. Everything else would follow from the proof. So she laid stone, and Wynne laid stone beside her. And the stove grew. By the 1st of November, the outer skin was complete. The chimney pipe, 6-inch diameter, rose from the crown of the stove through a carefully constructed stone collar in the roof beam and poked up into the open air above the mounded earth ceiling, modest and dark against the pale sky. From outside, the shelter was almost invisible. A low rise in the earth, a pipe, nothing else. From inside it was something else. Wynne stood in the center of the cellar on the 1st of November and turned slowly, looking at the walls, the floor, the shelves. Era had built the bed frame notched into the far wall, the small table, the lamp burning on its stone shelf, the stove standing in the center like a column, like a presence. She said Marin would recognize this. Era said, "That's what I wanted." Wynne looked at her. She said, "That's a particular thing to want. To build something that someone who died before you were born would recognize." Era said she showed me how. It seemed right that she'd be able to see it. Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she would." The day Era fired the stove for the first time was the 4th of November. She had chosen the wood with care. Dry hardwood split to the size Marin had specified, not too thick and not too thin, the pieces that would burn fast and hot rather than slow and smoldering. The firebox packed precisely, not too full. Marin's notation was exacting 60% capacity, no more. The point was not a long burn. The point was a fast one. Intense heat generated quickly stripped by the baffles of nearly every calorie absorbed into the stone. She lit the kindling. The draft caught immediately. A sound like a sharp intake of breath. Then the fire establishing itself, growing, the roar building inside the firebox as the hardwood caught and the temperature climbed. She watched through the small iron door for a time. Then she closed it. For an hour, the fire burned. She could hear it, the contained, purposeful sound of it, not the crackle of an open hearth, not the pop and spit of wood exposed to air. Something more deliberate, more focused, the sound of energy being converted rather than wasted. Then she sealed the air intake, the way Marin had described, precisely. The fire subsided. The stovepipe, which had been hot to the touch, began to cool as the gases thinned. And then, nothing. Silence. She sat at the small table and waited. 1 hour, 2. She read. She ate a small meal. She tended the oil lamp. 4 hours after she'd sealed the firebox, she stood up and walked to the stove. Put her good hand flat against the outer stone. Warm. Not hot, warm. The warmth of a stone that has been sitting in afternoon sunlight, but coming from inside, from the mass of it, from the tons of stone and clay that had been drinking in heat for 4 hours and were only now beginning to release what they'd stored. She stood with her hand flat against the stone for a long time. The warmth came through her palm, up her arm, into her shoulder, into the place between her shoulder blades that had been cold for so long she had stopped noticing. She was alone. No one was watching. No one was there to say it worked, to validate it, to perform the moment into something larger than it was. It was just her and the stone, and the warmth the stone had learned from the fire. She sat down on the cellar floor, put her back against the base of the stove, and felt the warmth move through her coat, through her shirt, into her spine, into the deep cold places that 2 months of mountain autumn had packed into her bones. She didn't cry loudly, just a few tears, quiet ones, the kind that come not from sadness, but from the sudden absence of something you've been holding against. When the thing you've been braced against is no longer there. When the cold you've been fighting internally constantly without knowing you were fighting it lifts. For the first time in 18 years, she was warm, in a place that was hers, that she had built, that a woman she would never meet had shown her how to build. She sat against the warm stone until the lamp burned low. Then she refilled it. Then she read until she fell asleep at the table, which was the first time she had fallen asleep from comfort rather than exhaustion since she had come to the Aldenmore Range. In the morning, she went outside. The sky was the color of pewter. The air had the specific feeling, that dense, pressurized stillness that precedes significant weather. The high ridges were invisible behind cloud cover that sat low and heavy over the range. Gideon was making his way up the path. He appeared at the edge of the tree line below the hollow, moving with the careful pace of a man who respects terrain. And when he reached her, he stopped and looked at the mound of earth with the pipe and said nothing for a moment. He said, "You finished it," she said last night. He said, and she said, "It works." He looked at her face, at whatever was different in it now. He said, "I can see that." He looked up at the sky, the way people look when they're reading something that's been written in a language they know but haven't spoken in a while. He said, "Wind tells me you found something in the chest." "Beyond the journal." Era said, "Yes." He said, "I won't ask what. That's yours to decide what to do with." He looked at the sky again, longer this time. He said, "I want you to know something. Harlan Voss's family has been on this council for 30 years. What his father did or didn't do, I can't speak to. I was a child. But what I know is that the land you're standing on was fought for by a woman who deserved better than what she got. And you're standing on it, which means she got something after all." He looked back at her. He said one more thing. He said it quietly. He said, "The old-timers are saying this winter is going to be the worst in 30 years. The signs are there if you know how to read them. So whatever you've built down there, I hope it's ready." He looked at the pipe. The faintest thread of steam rose from it, the last exhaled breath of last night's fire still working its way out of the stone. He said, "Because it's coming." He turned and went back down the path the way he'd come. Era stood in the pewter light and looked at the sky above the Aldenmore Range. The clouds were moving from the north, fast, dense, the kind of clouds that mean business, the kind that have been building for a long time and have finally arrived at the place they intend to be. She went back inside. She brought the remaining wood in from the outdoor pile. She checked the door seal, the heavy insulated plank she'd fitted into the entrance frame, the clay-packed gap around the stovepipe collar. She lit the lamp. She fired the stove, and she sat down at the small table with Marin's journal and turned to a chapter she hadn't read yet. A chapter titled in Marin's precise, unhurried hand, "What the Earth Holds." Outside, the first snow began to fall. The snow began on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it was something else entirely. Not snow the way snow usually arrives in the Aldenmore Range, gradual and negotiable, the kind that accumulates politely and gives you time to adjust. This was different. This came from the north with the specific focused intention of something that has been gathering force for a very long time and has finally found its direction. The wind arrived first. It hit the high ridges sometime before dawn on Wednesday. And Era felt it even underground, a low vibration in the stone walls, a pressure change in the air of the cellar that made her ears pop slightly when she swallowed. She lay in her bed frame and listened to it. The sound it made above her through 2 feet of earth and sod, and the heavy timber of the roof was a muffled roar. Constant. The voice of something very large, moving very fast. She got up, fired the stove. The draft caught perfectly, pulling hard, in the way a good chimney pulls when there's serious pressure differential outside. The fire took hold and roared in the firebox contained purposeful, and she loaded it precisely to Marin's specification and sealed the air intake and let it do its work. Then she made coffee. Then she sat at the small table with Marin's journal and listened to the world come apart above her. Because that was what was happening up there. She could hear it in the way the vibration changed over the course of the morning building in frequency and intensity. The low roar becoming something higher and more complex. Multiple tones layered over each other. The way water sounds when it's moving over different depths simultaneously. The wind found every edge above her, every stone lip, every irregularity in the landscape, and it sang against all of them at once. Below ground, the air in the cellar was still. Absolutely still. The lamp flame stood straight up without the slightest tremor. The steam from her coffee rose in a perfectly vertical column and then dispersed gently at about eye level. The temperature, which she'd been monitoring with the small thermometer she'd mounted on the wall, held at 68 degrees. Exactly. She thought about the town. Greystone Hollow sat in the valley below the range, which offered some protection from the prevailing westerly winds, but provided no shelter whatsoever from a true north wind. True north wind came down the valley like water down a pipe, funneled and accelerated by the terrain on either side. She'd noticed this on her walks down. The way the trees in the valley bent preferentially. The way the flags on the post office flew in a direction that didn't match what the weather was doing on the ridges. She thought about Gideon's store, the clapboard walls, the old single-pane windows in the back room that rattled every time a truck went past on the main road. She thought about the town hall, which she'd glimpsed from the street, once a 19th century frame building, with an addition on the back that someone had built in the 1970s with the confidence of that era in the permanence of cheap energy. She thought about Harlan Voss's house. She'd seen it only from a distance. It was the largest house in Greystone Hollow, set back from the main road behind a long driveway. White clapboard 2 stories with a wraparound porch, and she'd noticed an expanse of large-paned windows across the south face that offered what must be in good weather an exceptional view of the range. In good weather. She opened Marin's journal to a passage she'd read twice before and read it a 3rd time. The greatest thermal liability of the modern house is the window. We have convinced ourselves that light is worth the cost of the heat it lets escape, and in a climate like this one, we are wrong. Glass is not a wall. It is a membrane, and a membrane, no matter how well engineered, is always negotiating with what's on the other side. She turned the page. Stone does not negotiate. Outside, the wind made a sound she didn't have a word for. Not a howl, not a roar. Something that combined both and added something underneath them, a subsonic pressure that she felt more in her sternum than her ears. She drank her coffee. She read. The storm ran for 6 days. She knew this afterwards from Gideon's accounting of it. During the storm itself, she had no particular sense of the days as separate units. There was the rhythm of the stove, one firing each morning, the precise ritual of it, the hardwood loaded to 60% capacity, the draft opening the roar, building the hour of contained combustion, the ceiling. Then the long, slow gift of the stone releasing what it had stored, the temperature holding steady all day, and through the night without any additional fuel. There was the rhythm of meals, beans and flatbread, dried apples she'd found at the bottom of the canvas bag Wynne had brought. Coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon from the small store of dried herbs she'd gathered along the creek in October. There was reading. She worked through the second half of Marin's journal, the technical sections she'd been saving, the detailed observations of the 3 winters Marin had spent in this space, proving her system. The careful notations of temperature at various points throughout each day. The fuel logs precise to the pound, demonstrating what 60% capacity of good hardwood cost against what it provided in return. The external temperature observations which Marin had recorded daily by climbing out of the cellar at dawn and reading a thermometer mounted on the north face of the stone marker at the property line. The coldest recorded temperature in Marin's 3 winters, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Internal temperature during that event, 66 degrees. Difference 88 degrees. From 1 morning fire, 1 hour, dry hardwood. Era sat with that arithmetic for a while. Then she thought about what was happening in the town below and the arithmetic of that. The 3rd day, she climbed out to check the chimney pipe. She had to push hard to get the door open. The snow had drifted against it overnight, and when she finally leveraged it inward and climbed the stairs, she emerged into a world that had been fundamentally altered, white, in every direction. The hollow was filled nearly to the top of the old foundation walls, a smooth, unbroken surface of packed snow that bore no resemblance to the terrain she knew. The tree line on the ridge above had disappeared into cloud and driving snow. The sky and the earth were the same color, the same texture, a seamless white-gray that had no horizon. The wind was a physical force, not metaphorically, physically. It hit her when she cleared the doorframe, and she had to brace immediately, feet planted wide, the cold of it reaching through every layer she was wearing and making its position clear within seconds. She found the chimney pipe by feel as much as sight, a dark stick in the white, and confirmed it was clear. The faintest thread of vapor rose from it. Last night's fire still working its slow way out through the stone. She was outside for approximately 90 seconds. Then she went back down. The warmth of the cellar received her like an embrace. She stood on the stairs and let it. Stood there for longer than was strictly necessary, breathing the still warm air, feeling it work its way back into her face and hands, and thought about what it would cost to stand outside for very long in those conditions. And then she thought about the people who had no choice. Because not everyone had a cellar. Not everyone had a stove that didn't need electricity. Not everyone had 2 feet of earth and a season's worth of Marin Mosswood's hard-won knowledge between themselves and what was happening above. She sat with that for a while, too. On the 4th day, she heard something she couldn't immediately identify. A crack, sharp and brief, from somewhere above and to the south. Then another. Then silence. She'd learn later that it was power lines. The weight of ice on them accumulated over 4 days of freezing precipitation had reached the tolerance limit of the poles. The lines came down in sections, a cascade of failures running south from the substation at the edge of town, each pole failing and pulling the next until the entire grid serving Greystone Hollow was down. In the cellar, her oil lamp burned on. She noted the sound in the margin of Marin's journal under the date. Something snapping to the south. Power lines, possibly. Then she kept reading. The silence came on the morning of the 7th day. She noticed it before she was fully awake. The absence of the vibration in the walls that had been constant for 6 days. The absence of the multi-toned voice of the wind through the landscape above her. Just quiet. A quiet so complete it had texture, like something you could touch. She lay in her bed frame and listened to the quiet for a long time. Then she got up and fired the stove and made coffee and climbed the stairs and pushed the door open. The world had been remade. That was the only phrase for it. The world she had learned over 2 months, the particular shapes of the hollow, the angle of the slope above the old foundation, the distance to the tree line, all of it was gone. Replaced. Under 10 feet of snow in places, under drifts that had built up against the terrain and created new shapes, new hills, new valleys, none of which bore any relationship to what had been there before. The sky was extraordinary, brilliant blue, the particular blue of high altitude and cold air, a blue so saturated it looked artificial, looked like something in a painting by someone who had been accused of exaggeration and was wrong. The sun was already well up, and it hit the snow with a light so bright it required narrowing her eyes down to almost nothing within a few seconds of looking. Every surface glittered. The chimney pipe stood in the middle of all this whiteness, dark and modest, and from it rose a thin plume of steam, perfectly vertical in the still air. The faint, nearly invisible exhalation of last night's fire. She stood at the top of the stairs and breathed the crystal air. Cold. The specific cold of aftermath, colder in some ways than the storm itself, the air having been wrung of all its moisture dry and sharp, the kind that makes your nostrils feel brittle when you inhale. She thought Gideon. She thought the town. She thought 2 people died. She didn't know this yet. She would learn it later. But she thought about it anyway, the way you think about probable things when you understand the conditions that create them. She went back inside. She was eating breakfast, sitting at the small table with a cup of tea and the last of the dried apple when she heard them. Footsteps. 2 sets. Moving slowly. The sound of people walking in deep snow on snowshoes, the distinctive wide-tracked shuffle of it. She sat still. They were coming from the direction of the town path. She heard them reach the hollow. Stop. One of them said something she couldn't make out through the earth above her. Then they moved again, differently, more searching, looking. She heard one of them stop near the chimney pipe. Then the other one came to it too. Then, after a moment, the sound of a shovel. Someone digging, working toward her door. Gideon's voice. Muffled, but recognizable. He said her name. She said, "I'm here." She heard him exhale. The specific, sustained exhale of a man releasing something he's been holding for days. She unbarred the door and pushed it inward. Bright light fell down the staircase. She climbed toward it. 2 men stood at the top of the excavated entrance, silhouetted against the brilliant sky. Gideon and Harlan Voss. Gideon's face when he saw her was something she would not describe to anyone and would remember for the rest of her life. Relief so complete it looked briefly like grief. Because relief that large has to travel through you like grief does. It can't just sit on the surface. He said, "You're all right." She said, "I'm all right." He said, "You're warm." She said, "Come down." They came down the stairs, both of them, into the cellar, into the warmth. The effect was immediate and visible. Gideon's face, which had been red and strained from cold and the exertion of snowshoeing for hours through deep drifts, began to relax. The set of his jaw softened. He pulled off one glove and held his bare hand out in the air of the cellar. Just held it there, feeling. Harlan Voss was having a different experience. He stood in the center of the cellar and looked. Really looked. The way a man looks when the evidence in front of him is incompatible with what he understood to be true, and he is processing that incompatibility in real time. His coat was expensive and soaked. His boots were good boots, and they were dripping on the stone floor. His face, which Era had seen twice before in states of comfortable authority, was not comfortable now. He looked at the walls, the work, the shelves, the oil lamp burning, the thermometer on the wall reading 68 degrees. He looked at the stove, walked to it slowly, like a man approaching something he doesn't entirely trust. Put his gloved hand against the outer stone, then pulled the glove off and put his bare hand against it, held it there. She watched him feel the warmth coming out of the stone, the steady, calm, unhurried warmth of mass, doing exactly what mass does when it has been taught well. He turned around. He said how. Not a full question, just the word. She said masonry heater. My great-grandmother designed it. 1 fire, 1 hour every morning. The stone absorbs the heat. Then it releases it for the next 22 hours. He looked at the stove. He said there's no electricity. She said no. He said there's no fuel tank, no propane, no supply line. She said no. He said just wood. She said hardwood, dry, about 8 pounds a day. He stood there. His house, she would later learn, had cost him $300,000 to build 12 years ago. It had a central heating system that the contractor had described as state-of-the-art. It had large south-facing windows that the architect had described as a connection to the landscape. It had $42,000 worth of custom cabinetry in the kitchen that was now partially covered in snow, because the south-facing window in the great room had cracked on the 3rd day of the storm, the seal failing under the sustained pressure of the wind, and the drift that had formed against the glass had pushed inward through the crack, until there was a miniature glacier occupying the space between the kitchen island and the fireplace. He had burned the dining room chairs on the 4th day. Good chairs, solid cherry, his mother's. She watched him understand that. She watched him stand in a room that was 68 degrees and understand what he had burned to stay 45 degrees in his own house. He said your great-grandmother knew about this exact system. She said she built it, proved it. 3 winters. He said, and nobody. He stopped. He said nobody knew. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the drawer of the small table, took out the folded oilcloth, set it on the table. He looked at it. She unwrapped it carefully. The pages were exactly as she'd found them. Marin's precise handwriting, the entries running from polite disagreement, through pressure and legal maneuvering, to the final curtailed entry that ended mid-sentence. She laid them flat on the stone surface of the table. She said she tried to tell people. He didn't move toward the pages. She said your father's name is in there. Silence. She said Edmund Voss. 4 visits. A disputed ownership notice filed with the county. Legal fees she couldn't sustain. An isolated woman with no institutional support, and a man who understood exactly how to use that against her. The lamp burned. The stove radiated. She said she didn't leave. She was pushed. And the work, this work, the thing that could have changed how this entire valley handles winter, it sat in a chest in a collapsed cellar for 23 years, because one man wanted a piece of land he didn't need and couldn't stand the idea of a woman on a mountain being right about something. Voss looked at the pages. He had the look of a man reading an accounting he did not commission and cannot dispute, because he'd known some of this, not the details, not the specifics. But he'd grown up in a house where the name Mosswood, if it came up at all, was handled with the particular delicacy reserved for things that don't bear examination. He'd grown up understanding without being told that the land his father had wanted and failed to get was a subject you moved past quickly. He'd grown up and run for council and served for 11 years and told a girl with $20 and a rusty key that she would not survive the winter. He stood in the proof that she had. He was not a stupid man. That Era had decided somewhere in the weeks of thinking about him was actually the complicated part. A stupid man was easier. A stupid man didn't know what he was inheriting. Harlan Voss was not stupid, and some part of him had always known that the silence around certain things was a shape. That shapes that deliberate had been made deliberately. That someone had made them. He looked at the pages for a long time. He did not pick them up. Then he said, "My mother was in that house." Not a defense, just a fact placed on the table beside the other facts. She said, "I know." He said she's 71 years old. She has a bad hip. She hasn't been warm in 6 days. She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "Bring her here." He didn't say anything. She said, "There's room. The stove heats this space without effort. Bring her here until the roads are clear and the power is restored." He said, "Why would you?" She said, "Because she's 71 with a bad hip and she's cold. That's why." Gideon, who had been standing quietly by the staircase this entire time, made a sound. Very small. Just an exhale. But it carried something in it. Voss looked at the pages one more time. Then he said, "I'll need to think about what's right. About what I owe." She said, "Yes, you will." She picked up the pages, folded them, put them back in the oilcloth, put them in the drawer. She said, "That's for later. Right now, there are people in that town who are cold. That's the first problem." She looked at Gideon. She said, "How bad is it?" He sat down on the bench wall, the exhaustion visible now that the crisis of finding her alive had passed. He took off his hat, ran a hand over his face. He said 2 people didn't make it through. The Hendersons on the north end, older. Heating system failed first night, and they didn't have a backup. He said it quietly, without drama. The way you say the things that can't be undone. She said, "And the rest." He said the town hall has a generator. People have been going there. But it's not designed for this. It's a meeting room. There are 40, maybe 50 people in there on cots. She said the generator. He said running on diesel. "We have maybe 3 days of fuel left at current consumption," she said, "and the roads." He said impassable until the county plows come through. That could be another week. They're dealing with every road in 4 counties. She sat down at the table. Gideon said, "I know what you're thinking." She said, "No, you don't." He said, "You're thinking it's not enough. 1 stove, 1 cellar. You can't heat 50 people in here." She said, "I'm thinking about the clay." He looked at her. She said, "The clay deposit, 200 yards north of here." Marin mapped it. "There's enough material for a dozen stoves." "More." He said, "You can't build a dozen stoves." She said, "Not by myself." She looked at him. She said, "But there are people in that town hall right now with nothing to do and every reason to learn something useful." A long silence. Gideon put his hat back on. He said, "The ground is frozen solid." She said, "The clay deposit is along the creek bank. The water kept it from freezing as deep." "I checked it 2 weeks ago." He said, "You checked it 2 weeks ago." She said, "I check everything Marin mapped. I always have." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You planned for this." She said, "Marin planned for this." "I just read her notes." He sat with that for a second. Then he stood up, picked up his pack, looked at Voss. He said, "We're going to need people who can follow directions." Voss said, "I can organize people. That I know how to do." He said it without the comfortable authority he'd had in the hardware store, just as a plain statement of what he was capable of, what he could actually offer, which was something, not everything, but something. She looked at him. She said, "Then start with your mother. Bring her up." Then we'll talk about the rest." He nodded once, climbed the stairs, gone. Gideon looked at her. He said, "You know this is going to change things." She said, "I know." He said, "When people understand what's here, what Marin built, what you rebuilt, they're not going to be able to unknow it." She said, "Good." He said, "Voss is going to have to live in a town that knows what his father did." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's a hard thing." She said, "It's a true thing. Hard and true aren't the same." He looked at her. Then he smiled. Small, but real. He said, "She would have liked you." She said, "Marin?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I think I would have liked her too." He climbed the stairs. She stood alone in the cellar for a moment. Then she opened Marin's journal to the last page and read the final complete entry, the one before the mid-sentence cut off one more time. Marin had written, "The system works. The proof is complete. What remains is the telling. The hardest part always is not the building. It is convincing the people who are comfortable that comfort can be achieved differently, that the way they know is not the only way, that a woman alone on a mountain might have learned something worth learning. I hope whoever you are, that you are someone who does not give up easily." Era closed the journal, put it on the shelf. Then she climbed the stairs into the brilliant cold morning. What followed was not simple. Nothing real ever is. Getting Eleanor Voss up the mountain, 71 years old, with a bad hip in 10 feet of snow, required 2 hours and 3 people and an improvised sled that Gideon constructed from salvaged timber in 40 minutes flat. A process Era watched with genuine respect for a man who kept his practical knowledge ready, regardless of what the world was currently doing. Eleanor Voss was a small woman with white hair cut very short and eyes that were disconcertingly the same pale blue as her son's. She did not complain. Not once. She held the rope of the sled with both hands and watched the terrain move past and said nothing until they reached the entrance to the cellar. And then she looked at it, at the modest mound of snow-covered earth with the dark pipe, and said, "This is where the warmth is coming from." Gideon said yes. She said, "I felt it from up the path." She said it with the tone of someone who has reached the age where remarkable things are still remarkable, but no longer surprising. They got her down the stairs. She stood in the cellar, felt the warmth, looked at the stove. She said to no one in particular, Edmund was wrong. No one spoke. She said he was wrong about many things. That's not something I could say while he was alive. I'm saying it now. She sat down on the bench wall with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned to trust their body's negotiation with gravity. She looked at Era. She said, "You look like her, around the eyes." Era said, "You knew Marin." She said, "I was a girl. She came to town sometimes. I remember her because she was the only person I'd ever seen who walked like she knew exactly where she was going, even when she was just coming in for supplies." She looked at the journal on the shelf. She said, "My husband was afraid of people like that." Era said, "People like what?" She said, "People who know things he didn't. People who didn't need his permission to be right." She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "I should have said something when I understood what he was doing. I didn't." The lamp burned. The stove radiated. Eleanor Voss sat in the warmth that should have existed in this valley for 23 years and did not because of her husband and her silence, and she sat in that truth the same way Harlan had stood in it, without flinching, without excuse. Era said, "It's here now." She said it simply, not as forgiveness, just as fact. The warmth was here now. Whatever had been done to delay it, whatever had been lost in the delay, the warmth was here now. Eleanor looked at her. She said, "Yes, it is." Over the next 4 days, people came up the mountain, not all at once, not in any organized way, but in the specific pragmatic fashion of people who are cold and have learned that warmth exists in a particular direction they came. First, in 2s and 3s, families with children who needed to be somewhere their extremities wouldn't be in danger. Then, the older residents of the town hall who had the least reserves. Then once word moved through the rough, improvised communication system of people talking to each other in a town without electricity more. The cellar was not large enough for all of them, but they didn't all need to be in the cellar. That was what Era spent the first afternoon explaining to whoever would stand still long enough to listen. The cellar was an example. The principle could be applied anywhere. The clay deposit was real. She took 4 people to it the second afternoon, Gideon and 3 others, and they worked the bank with pickaxes and their hands and came back with enough clay for 2 stoves. She showed them Marin's diagrams. Simplified because the people she was teaching didn't need to understand the complete physics they needed to understand the sequence. Firebox, baffles, mass. That was the sequence. Everything else was detail. 2 of the 4 picked it up immediately. One of them was a woman in her 60s named Dorothea, who had the compact, efficient manner of someone who had spent her life doing physical work and found theory interesting, mainly in its application. She looked at Marin's diagrams for about 10 minutes and then started asking specific questions. Good questions. The kind that showed she was already running the process in her head. Era answered everyone. Gideon built a temporary above-ground structure near the site of the original foundation, just enough roof and windbreak to allow work to continue, and they began laying the first community stove there. Era instructing and correcting Dorothea, doing much of the laying herself, the others working the clay and moving stone. Harlan Voss organized the logistics, food distribution, the movement of people to and from the mountain, the communication with the county emergency management, which had finally established a radio contact on the 3rd day after the storm. He was efficient at this. Organized. He took direction from Gideon without visible resistance, and he took direction from Era without any resistance at all. She noticed this. She thought about what it cost him. She thought about the difference between a man who cannot change and a man who has not yet been given sufficient reason to. On the 5th day after the storm, Wynne arrived. She came up with the afternoon group and went straight to the cellar and stood in the doorway and looked at Era and said, "I told Gideon you'd be fine." Era said, "You told him not to extend the credit." Wynne said, "I told him that too. I was wrong about one and right about one. That's better than I usually do." She came in, sat on the bench, looked at the stove. She said the second community stove. Dorothea says it's nearly complete. Era said she's a fast learner. Wynne said she built a stone retaining wall in her back garden 2 summers ago by herself. 6 feet high, 30 feet long. Nobody knew she'd done it until it was done. "That's Dorothea." She looked at the journal. She said, "Have you finished it?" Era said, "The last entry cuts off." Wynne said, "I know. I read it." She said, "What do you think she was going to say?" Era thought about this. She said, "I think she was going to say that the hard part was never the building. The hard part was the permission." Wynne looked at her. She said the permission. She said the permission that women like her never get. To be right. To be right publicly, durably, in a way that lasts. She was right. She had proof. 3 winters of proof. And it didn't matter because she didn't have the permission of the people who decide what matters. She said, and now Era said, and now there are 2 stoves. And people who know how to build more. Wynne was quiet. Then she said, "You don't need their permission anymore." She said it simply, as an observation. Era said she never did. She just didn't live long enough here to make that stick. They sat with that. The lamp burned. The stove held its warmth. The county roads were cleared on the 10th day after the storm ended. The power came back in stages over the following week, unreliable at first, then stabilizing as the utility crews worked their way through the damage. Life in Greystone Hollow resumed its outward form, but something had shifted. Shifted in the way that things shift when they break along a fault line that was always there when the break reveals what was underneath, and what was underneath turns out to be something more solid than anyone knew. People knew about the stove. They knew about the clay deposit and the soapstone and the design that had been sitting in an iron chest for 23 years, waiting for someone to find it. They knew the name Marin Mosswood, many of them for the first time, and they knew it attached to something real and provable and still standing. They also knew the other part. It moved through the town the way truth moves through small communities, not in announcement, but in accumulation. A remark here, a conversation there. The pages Era had found were not secret. She hadn't said they were. And what they described, the 4 visits, the disputed notice, the slow, deliberate pressure applied to an isolated woman with insufficient legal resources, it was the kind of story that once heard sits differently in the mind than information. It explained the silence, and explained silences always change things. Harlan Voss went to a council meeting in January, sat in his usual seat. The meeting proceeded. But the room was different in a way that had no single visible cause. Just different. The way a room is different when the people in it know something they didn't know before. He didn't run for re-election in March. He didn't announce why. He sold the house in April. The large one with the south-facing windows and the custom cabinetry and the rooms he had heated at great expense and inadequate effect through the worst storm in 30 years. He bought a smaller place on the east side of town, an older house, stone foundation, small windows, built by someone who understood in the way people understood before cheap energy made understanding unnecessary, that a house was in conversation with its climate, and you were a fool to ignore what the climate was saying. Whether that was coincidence or intention, Era never knew. She didn't ask. Eleanor Voss stayed on the mountain through the end of January, by choice. She said the warmth agreed with her hip, which was true, and that she liked the quiet, which was also true. She sat in the cellar most mornings with Marin's journal reading, and occasionally she made notes in a small notebook she'd brought with her, and Era did not ask what the notes were, and Eleanor did not volunteer. On the day she went back down, she stood at the top of the stairs and looked out over the Aldenmore Range, the January sun on the snow, the extraordinary silence of the high country in deep winter. She said she should have a marker, somewhere on this property, with her name on it. Era said, "I've thought about that." Eleanor said, "I have some money from Edmund's estate. Money I have felt for some time that I was holding in trust for something I hadn't identified yet." She looked at Era. She said, "I think I've identified it." Era said, "That's your choice to make." She said, "Yes, it is." She went down the mountain. March came, and the snow began to relinquish its hold on the lower elevations, grudgingly at first, and then with more commitment, the brown earth reappearing in patches along the south-facing slopes, the creek running loud and fast with meltwater. Wynne came up the mountain 3 days a week. She and Dorothea and Era worked on what they had started calling, without quite deciding, to the second building. Not a cellar this time. A workshop, above ground. Stone-walled, earth-roofed, with a larger version of Marin's heater at its center. A space where several people could work at once. Where the diagrams in the journal could be taught properly. People came up to help. Not because Era asked them, because they had learned something in November and they wanted to know more. Because Dorothea talked and Gideon talked and word moved through a small community in the way water moves through stone, slow and inevitable, and reshaping what it passes through. By April, the workshop had its first class. 8 people, from their mid-30s to their late 70s. Farmers, a retired teacher, a woman who ran the post office, a young man who'd come to Greystone Hollow from somewhere else and stayed as people sometimes do because the valley got into him before he noticed. Ira taught from Marin's diagrams. She added her own notes in the margins, her own observations, the things she'd learned through doing it wrong, and then doing it right, and then doing it right again until right was a thing she could do without consulting the page. She was not, she would have said, if asked, a teacher. But she knew how to show someone where the stone wanted to split. She knew how to describe the feel of mortar that was mixed correctly. She knew how to look at a person's confusion and hand them the relevant page of Marin's journal and let the woman who had written it do the explaining. Because Marin was the better teacher. She'd always been. One afternoon in late April, when the class had gone and Wynne was packing up her things and the light was going long and golden across the Aldenmore Range, Gideon came up. He came in without announcing himself because that was how he moved through the world. He set a package on the work table, looked around the workshop, looked at the stove. He said, "How many has this valley built now?" She said 7. 2 more started. He said, "And the designs are spreading." She said Dorothea wrote them up. She sent copies to 3 other townships. He said Marin wrote them up. She said Dorothea added the practical notes. The kind that you learn from doing it wrong. He nodded. He said there's a historical society over in Dunmore. They contacted the town last week. They heard about the journal. They want to document it properly, the design, the history of it. She said Marin's name. He said yes, her name, her work, on the record. He looked at her. He said it's a start. She said it's what she asked for. She said, "Finish what I couldn't say." That's what she wanted. Not credit. Just the work to be said, out loud, where it couldn't be filed away again. He picked up the package from the table. He said, "I brought you something." She opened it. A journal. New. Binders leathered dark green with good heavy paper. The kind of thing built to last. He said Wynne picked it out. I just carried it up. She turned it over in her hands. She said, "Tell her thank you." He said, "Tell her yourself. She's standing right behind you." She turned around. Wynne was in the doorway, arms crossed, the expression of a woman who has been doing thoughtful things and deflecting credit for them for 30 years and has no intention of stopping now. She said it's just a notebook. Era said it's not just a notebook. Wynne said, "Well, write something worth reading in it, then it'll be something." The light was going, the golden late April light moving across the ridge and beginning its slow departure. The shadows lengthening from the east, the temperature in the workshop staying warm and steady because the stove held what it had been given and gave it back without drama. Gideon and Wynne went down the mountain together, the way they'd been going down mountains together for 30 years. Era stood at the door of the workshop and watched them go. Then she went inside. She sat at the work table with the new journal open in front of her and Marin's journal beside it, and she looked at the last page of Marin's writing, the entry that cut off mid-sentence. The sentence that had never been finished. She thought about what it would have said. She thought about a woman who had walked like she knew exactly where she was going, even when she was just coming in for supplies. Who had built something true and been pushed away from it before she could finish the telling? Who had sealed the most important parts in oilcloth in an iron chest and hoped that whoever found it would be someone who did not give up easily? She picked up her pen. She opened the new journal. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. April. The year. The Aldenmore Range. Then she wrote, "This is what she built, and this is what it taught me." She sat with that line for a moment. Then she kept writing, because that was what you did with what you'd been given. You didn't hold it. You didn't seal it away in a chest and hope it survived. You put it in words that other people could read. You put it in stone that other people could feel. You put it in the hands of the people who came up the mountain not knowing what they were looking for, and left knowing how to build something that would keep them warm. Outside, the last light left the ridge. Inside, the stove held everything it had been given. Steady, warm, patient as stone is patient, the way warmth holds when it has been built right, the way knowledge holds when it has been given freely, the way a woman's work holds when someone finally refuses to let it be forgotten.